Hi, my name is Bart.
My name is Lewis. We are two pilots with a passion for history.
Welcome to our channel, High on History. Welcome to another special episode of High on History.
That's right. We're invited by NATO, or in French, l'OTAN, which has its headquarters just behind us in Evere, which is the northeastern part of Brussels.
Here is the NATO headquarters, where the heads of state and the ministers of defense meet.
Yes, as you all know, NATO recently has been in the spotlight because of the war in Ukraine, and we're here to discuss that, the history and the future of NATO.
Professor Jamie Shea, welcome for being on High on History. Today we are seated in a very special place. It's the historical reconstructed, office of the Secretary General of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Could you please be so kind to introduce yourself?
Well, yes, as you said, my name is Jamie Shea. I've worked at NATO for 38 years. I started during the Cold War, 9 years before the Berlin Wall came down in 1980, so I saw the end of the Cold War here, and then I continued at NATO all the way through the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO's intervention in the Balkans, NATO's intervention in Afghanistan, in Libya, right the way through to 2018, when unfortunately for me, I turned 65. That was NATO's mandatory retirement age, so I had to leave. And since that time, I've been working in the area of international philanthropy. I've worked for a couple of think tanks, and I'm also a university professor.
Thank you once again for being on High on History. Okay, if I call you Jamie, is that okay?
Everybody else does, so please, Bart, do the same.
Okay, we'll do that. First of all, a general question. What does NATO or l'OTAN stand for today?
Well, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was founded in 1949, so it's already been going for 73 years, which means that it's the longest politico-military alliance in recorded history. It's a security community, and it brings together 30 democratic countries, 2 in North America, and the other 28 in Europe. Soon that number will go up to 32 because, as no doubt all of your viewers and listeners know, last summer Sweden and Finland also applied to join NATO, and the process of ratification through the parliaments so that they can join NATO is almost complete. So it will soon go to 32. It's a security community where the countries work together to ensure and to enhance their security. And they do this in 3 ways. They do this first and foremost through collective defence. The obligation under the NATO treaty, which is called Article 5 in the NATO jargon, which is to come to each other's assistance in the case of an armed attack. Some people call this, the Three Musketeers clause. You remember the famous novel, The Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all. The second function of NATO is crisis management, crisis prevention. In other words, the Allies work together to deal with crises on the periphery of Europe or even beyond, which could impact on their security. And the third way in which they achieve security is called cooperative security. In other words, it's working with like-minded democracies, like-minded partners in Europe, in North Africa, in the Middle East, in the Caucasus, and now also in the Asia Pacific, on challenges like climate change, on cyber attacks, on disinformation, whatever the challenge, because the idea is by working together with these like-minded partners, you can achieve a more rules-based order with more authority for international law, which again improves everybody's collective security. So immediate collective defence, crisis management, cooperative security. That's what NATO is all about.
So why and how was NATO founded, if we go really back to the beginning?
Well, at the end of the Second World War, there was no big peace treaty, no big conference at Versailles, as what happened after the First World War. Things were left very much hanging in the air. And the Americans quickly withdrew their forces from Europe because as far as they were concerned, the war was over, peace had been won, and they could demobilise, as they'd done after the First World War. But Stalin did not do that. Stalin maintained about 11 million soldiers in the field, occupied large amounts of Eastern Europe, and also seized large amounts of territory, parts of Finland, for example, parts of Romania. He refused to take his forces out of northern Iran for a long time at the end of the Second World War. Stalin also moved countries, and if you look at the map of Europe today, Poland is not in the same position as it was before 1939. Stalin changed borders, and it was quite clear that Stalin, unlike the United States, was not prepared to withdraw significant forces from forward positions that extended all the way to the border between East Germany, as it became, and West Germany. And so the Europeans became quite alarmed about this situation. Stalin violated his commitment at Yalta in February 1945 to hold free and fair elections. He would not let the legitimate governments of prior to World War II come back to Poland, to come back to Czechoslovakia, to come back to Hungary, etc. And he increasingly installed puppet communist governments loyal to Moscow. At the same time, the Western Europeans were completely shattered by the Second World War. Not just the vanquished, like Nazi Germany, but the victors, like France and the United Kingdom, which had to turn to the United States for loans to keep their economy afloat. So in the period from 1945 to 1948, you see the Europeans becoming increasingly anxious about the security vacuum in Europe, and the worries that Stalin would exploit this situation, not just to sort of push his forces forward, but to intimidate the governments, to demand that they make concessions, for example, that they would lose their independence. And the other thing that happened after the Second World War is that we have to remember that the Grand Alliance against Nazi Germany was a marriage of convenience. There was never any true cooperation between Stalin and the United States and the United Kingdom. There was a great deal of suspicion throughout. And in 1946, Stalin gives this very famous speech at the Bolshoi Ballet in Moscow, immediately after the war, announcing that now that the Nazi Germany is defeated, as far as he's concerned, he's going back to the ideological struggle against the West. You know, either communism triumphs or capitalism triumphs, but there's no room for the two in the world. So we have a situation where one event leads to another. For example, in 1948, there's a coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia, where the last independent government in Eastern Europe is taken from power. The foreign minister falls out of a window, Thomas Masaryk, in very suspicious circumstances. The communist government is installed. Then in 1948, Stalin tries to push the Allies out of Berlin, the famous Berlin airlift, because as long as they're in Berlin, he cannot have complete control of East Germany. The Americans respond magnificently with a big airlift of food. West Berlin remains in Allied hands. But all of these events lead to two consequences. Number one, the French and the British working together realised that they cannot have security without some kind of an American involvement in future European security arrangements. Economic recovery, Marshall Plan, doesn't work if there's not security. No security, no investment, no long-term planning, no international cooperation. At the same time, the mood in the United States, which is quite pro-Soviet at the end of World War II, the sense of working together, begins to change towards a fear of communism, of communist expansion. We have, for example, the Truman Doctrine of 1947, where President Truman proclaims that the United States will replace the British in the Eastern Mediterranean and will do what is necessary to defend freedom.
If Turkey is to have the assistance it needs, the United States must supply it. We are the only country able to provide that help.
From now on, it means that anti-communist America will make its influence felt in European affairs.
If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world.
We have in 1948 the famous Vandenberg Resolution of Senator Arthur Vandenberg of California, which for the first time allows the United States to turn its back on traditional neutrality, because remember, before the Second World War, America was a neutral country in international politics, and to enter alliances. So the mood both in Western Europe and in the United States changes, and the Americans agree in 1948 to sit down with the Europeans, notably the British and French, in Washington, and they negotiate the NATO treaty, which is finally ready and is approved on the 4th of April 1949. What is remarkable is that it's the first time that America has a commitment to Europe in peacetime, and it's only the second military alliance that the United States has signed in its entire history before 1949. You're going to ask me what the first one was, Bart, right? Yes, you are.
You know.
Yeah. You can't resist, I know. It's in 1778 with Benjamin Franklin and the Comte de Vergennes, the minister of Louis XVI of France after the American War of Independence.
Okay, so how does this newly formed alliance then respond to some events happening very soon after? 1949, the USSR drops the first atomic bomb, so that means they become a nuclear power, the second nuclear power after the US, and also, just very briefly afterwards as well, the Korean War starts in the 50s.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. These two events were very formative for the early years of NATO. The Soviet nuclear test in 1949, obviously the result of a great deal of espionage, unfortunately, the Soviet spies in British and American nuclear establishments, means, of course, that the West cannot rely upon the nuclear bomb for deterrence. There was a very famous American general at the time, Maxwell Taylor, who famously said, when they, the Soviets, get a bomb to neutralize our bomb, we have to get an army to neutralize their army. In other words, it's now in the interests of NATO to avoid a nuclear war because, of course, the risk of escalation, retaliation is too big. So it immediately means that NATO has to adopt a new strategy. The Allies meet in Lisbon in February 1952 and decide on the famous Lisbon force goals, which is that in order to fight and win a conventional war without the risk of nuclear escalation, which is too destructive, they need 96 divisions. So immediately you have a debate which has gone all the way through NATO's history, Bart, right the way through to this day, which is how much is enough in terms of how many forces do we need for a credible deterrence, how many of those are going to be supplied by the Americans, how many of those are going to be supplied by the Europeans, what is fair transatlantic burden sharing. But it means that although nuclear weapons are still part of NATO's strategy, their function is no longer to fight and win wars. That becomes impossible. The function of the nuclear bomb is to stop the other guy using his nuclear bomb against you. So that's the main effect. Korean War, absolutely fundamental. Lord Ismay, and his picture is somewhere around here, the first NATO Secretary General.
Just there in the bottom, yeah.
He said that the Korean War put the O into NATO. Before the Korean War, you don't have this. There's no NATO headquarters. There's no international staff. There's no NATO bureaucracy. There is not even a NATO Secretary General. There is a loose North Atlantic Council with deputies representing the member states. It's not in Paris, it's in London initially in those days. There are no American troops in Europe under NATO command. No General Eisenhower, no Shea, the NATO military command that we have now at Mons. The North Atlantic Treaty in 1949 does not set up a bureaucracy. The impact of the Korean War is that suddenly there is a worry that if Stalin is prepared to do reckless things by sort of pushing into South Korea with his North Korean ally, of course, Kim Il-sung, and if the communism is on the advance, if you like, there is a risk that in divided Germany, like divided Korea, Stalin may try something equivalent. So there is an urgency now in NATO to construct an integrated defence and a proper functioning organisation to give the strategic political direction to that integrated defence. So we have the first NATO Secretary General, 1950, Lord Ismay, who is nominated by Winston Churchill. We have NATO moving to Paris to set up a proper integrated structure at the Palais de Shea in Paris for the Secretariat, and SHAPE at Rocancourt near Fontainebleau. We have the first Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who arrives in 1951, General Dwight Eisenhower, because Truman believed that by nominating Eisenhower, he was nominating the symbol, the great hero of World War II, the symbol of the defence of Europe, who would be a great morale booster for the Europeans. You have, as I said, the Lisbon, very important meeting in NATO's history to establish a proper defence, and Eisenhower, who travels around the NATO countries, is given the task of organising the defence. So that NATO is not just ready on paper, but is ready with real capabilities. It's all about capabilities from there on. So the Soviet nuclear test, Korean War, really are the things that really established the NATO that we know today.
People would wonder as well, what is happening on the other side with the USSR, because we have this integrated structure, NATO, from the West, the US and the European allies. So what is actually Warsaw doing? And especially an event in 1955, West Germany, or what used to be divided between France, Great Britain and the US, they joined into one country and then join NATO. And how would the USSR respond to that?
Well, believe it or not, Bart, there is a period of détente. Because in March 1953, Stalin dies. And after Stalin dies, as you know, there is a period of transition in the Soviet leadership. There's a competition of who's going to succeed Stalin, a very bloody competition, by the way, in which certain Soviet leaders were assassinated. Khrushchev eventually emerges after 1956. He makes a secret speech at the 20th Party Congress in February 1956, denouncing Stalin and the Great Terror. So there is what we call in the mid-50s the Geneva spirit. Eisenhower, who despite being the first Supreme Allied Commander and the great hero of World War II, is not a bellicose general. Eisenhower believes very much in disarmament. He doesn't think it's good for the American economy to spend a lot of money on weapons at the time. He's in favour of détente. So believe it or not, after the death of Stalin, things become a little bit easier for NATO in the 1950s. It doesn't last long. At the end of the 50s, we go to the famous Berlin crises, and we go to the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, in 1962. But what you've seen in NATO history throughout the whole 73 years, periods of tension, even periods of confrontation, periods when adversaries have posed immediate threats, but also followed by periods of relaxation, periods of détente, where NATO can go on the political offensive, where it's possible to have arms control agreements, it's possible to find areas of cooperation with potential adversaries, there are areas of common interest. So that sort of shows that the beginning of that pattern. Now, West Germany coming into NATO in 1954 leads, on the other side, to the formation of the Warsaw Pact. But this is really formalistic, Bart, because the Soviet Union already has troops on the territories of these countries. They already have bilateral security agreements with the Soviet Union. So forming the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviet desire to give a kind of impression that there's an Eastern NATO, is really just putting la crème sur la table on something that already exists. But I do want to emphasise that in the mid-50s there is a period of détente. For example, the Soviet Union pulls troops out of Finland and also out of Austria. In 1955, the Austrian State Treaty is signed, and Austria becomes what it is today, a neutral country, now part of the European Union, but of course being a neutral country, not part of NATO. So in a way, it's the first kind of indication, which I think is also endemic in NATO's history, that if you're united, if you're strong, if you face down threats in a measured, calm way, the other guy eventually, stops pursuing a policy of outright confrontation with you, and also sees an interest in accommodation, in détente and so on. That's the formula that NATO has always worked. Not to pursue confrontation for confrontation's sake, that would be completely stupid, right? But to be strong, so the other guy eventually also sees an interest in a more cooperative kind of stance. Whether that's going to work, of course, today with Putin in Ukraine, we don't know yet. But it's been a successful recipe in NATO's history up to now.
But there were periods of détente in the 50s, but we have a big spike in confrontation, close to even a nuclear confrontation, maybe not NATO, but the US and the USSR, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. How did NATO respond to that crisis?
Well, it was probably the closest we've been to a nuclear war throughout the history of NATO. As Dean Rusk, the American Secretary of State, famously said, we went eyeball to eyeball, and they, the Soviets, blinked first. And if you read some of the more recent history, there's been lots of recent historical research into the Cuban Missile Crisis. They show that we were even closer to a potential nuclear war than people believed at the time, because the Soviet generals in Cuba had the ability to launch the weapons there, the SS-4 missiles, without Moscow having a controlling key, which is very worrying in terms of command and control. But that's, of course, another story, but for maybe another day. And until we had recently Mr. Putin and Dmitry Medvedev and other Russian leaders gesticulating irresponsibly with nuclear threats in Ukraine, Cuba was the closest we've been. But it also bears out about what I said about periods of tension being followed by periods of détente, because both the United States and the Soviet Union, of course, were seriously frightened by how easy it had been to negotiate yourself into a nuclear crisis, then not being able to climb down because of prestige, because of credibility, wanting the other person to blink first, and the pressure from the military on both sides to take action precipitously, believing that they had, a little window of opportunity that they had to exploit. In a way, we have to be sort of grateful to Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis that they resisted these pressures from certain quarters to take precipitous and potentially catastrophic military action, and to continue behind the scenes, the famous back channel as they called it, to negotiate. So the lesson of that was that they realised, to use the phrase which people still use today, including Jens Stoltenberg, my former boss, the Secretary General of NATO, quite rightly, a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. That was the conclusion. And so we had a period of détente, which lasted for several years. We had, for example, in 1963, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Both sides agreed to stop nuclear testing in the atmosphere, only underground. Then we had an agreement to prohibit nuclear weapons in space. We had the hotline. Although it wasn't a telephone, it was a fax machine at first. Isn't that? No, it's in the White House bar. But do you remember the famous hotline? And by the mid-60s, we had the beginning of nuclear arms control talks, which later became known as, SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, START, Strategic Arms Reduction Talks. We had the agreement on the prevention of nuclear war, yes, between the Soviet Union and the United States. But we also had, from the late 60s onwards, MBFR, Mutual Balanced Force Reductions. This is a bit techie, I know, but for the arms control community it's important, which was the beginning of talks on reducing the number of tanks, artillery, aircraft, helicopters, reducing the conventional forces in Europe. All of those things that you remember Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger doing all came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I think both sides recognized that they had to have shock absorbers, they had to have constraints, they had to have seat belts, if you like, which would prevent this slide into nuclear destruction happening so quickly. It was important for NATO because it led to a period where we understood that it wasn't enough simply to confront the Soviet Union. We had to understand the Soviet Union. We had to try to understand what was driving it. What were real Soviet security interests versus false Soviet security interests. Where would they be willing to compromise? And you can't do that if you don't talk to them. So we had a very famous Belgian foreign minister called Pierre Hamel in the 1960s, who was asked by NATO to look into this. And in 1967, he came forward with a very, very famous report called the Hamel Report, which became NATO doctrine for the next half century, which is that in looking at the Soviet Union or Russia, you have a mixture of deterrence, but dialogue. You have defense, but you have détente. And after the Cold War, Hamel's sort of legacy was really realised when we established the NATO-Russia Council here, for example, for many years. And we had a Russian ambassador to NATO and a Russian mission. And we were doing all kinds of cooperative things as well. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, although it was initially a bilateral Soviet-US crisis, ended up really transforming NATO into much more a political consultative machine, looking to have dialogue with adversaries, and took NATO away from what it had been up until the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was an essentially military command structure and military defence machine. The political part became much more important.
There's much more diplomacy also going on. Talking about diplomacy, people wonder why is the headquarters in Brussels, because it is also happening actually in this time period.
General de Gaulle, of course, came back to power in France in 1958 on the back of the crisis in Algeria, of course, and his promise to find a solution to that. De Gaulle was a French nationalist, of course. His party was very committed to French sovereignty and the supremacy of France's national interests. And de Gaulle basically wanted to reform NATO into a structure where France would have much more influence. And he wanted a so-called trilateral leadership of NATO, where it would be the United States, the UK and France as the members of the Security Council. It became known as the Directorate in NATO history. The three nuclear powers would basically form a kind of, like a UN Security Council in the alliance. As George Orwell says in 1984, all men are born equal, but some are born more equal than others. And basically this was anathema to countries like Belgium, to Pierre Hamel, or to the famous Belgian ambassador here, André de Stack, who thought, no, if there's this kind of two-tier NATO, we small countries are going to lose our voice, we're going to lose our influence. The Germans weren't happy, because of course they were not part, neither were the Italians, of this structure. And so de Gaulle became increasingly impatient that his desire to sort of Europeanise NATO, reform NATO, was not making progress. There was also a big difference on nuclear doctrine. De Gaulle built the French nuclear weapon, although the programme already started under the Fourth Republic, but de Gaulle completed the process. And de Gaulle believed that as France's doctrine was one of absolute nuclear deterrence, that should be NATO's doctrine as well. But in the 1967, NATO moved to a new doctrine called flexible response, which did not give up the nuclear option, but again, Bart, as I mentioned, put much more onus on improving conventional forces, and de Gaulle didn't agree with that. So in 1967, de Gaulle became frustrated with all of this, and basically decided that he was going to withdraw from NATO's integrated military structure. Now, a lot of people, including a lot of French people, believe that France had withdrawn from NATO. Absolutely not true. De Gaulle simply said, I'm taking French forces out of the NATO command. So no American general can tell French soldiers what to do and where to go. I'm taking my nuclear weapons out of the NATO collective planning structure. And de Gaulle ordered Shea to leave France. But he didn't order the NATO civilian staff at the Palais de Shea to leave. What happened is that the Belgians, again I mentioned this extremely important ambassador, André de Stack, as Hamel's ambassador here, negotiated and decided, well look, the easiest thing to do is to move NATO just a couple hundred kilometres north into Belgium. It made things easier for NATO. Belgium also saw, frankly, the employment opportunities of moving a big international organisation here, let's be frank, although the European Union was already here. The Belgians asked Shea to go to Casteau, near Mons, precisely because it was an area of high unemployment and they believed it would sort of generate jobs. NATO headquarters came here to Avere, to a military hospital. And one of my favourite photos of NATO is the ambassadors with their overcoats shivering in the cold in the winter of 1967 as this sort of prefabricated military hospital, which of course is still just over the road from here, was inaugurated, with the flags going up. It was still a construction site, there was still a lot of mud. But it was meant to be a temporary headquarters, but lasted for the next, like everything that, if you want to make something permanent, call it temporary, it lasted for the next half century. But it was a building which I loved very much indeed, because I spent 37 years of my NATO career in it, and it ended up serving NATO very well. So I think, yes, I think the Belgians saw an opportunity, but it's important to understand something. The move to Belgium was not just a physical move, because the Hamel report said, look, the De Gaulle episode shows what's wrong with NATO. The big guys dictate to the small guys, and this is not going to work. And therefore we need more political consultation. We need more transparency. Allies have got to tell each other what's going on. No more fait accomplis. No more my way or the highway. Take it or leave it. And so there was a committee formed under Hamel to look at, very much led by the Belgians, to basically democratise NATO, to make it a structure where there would be more sort of advanced planning. The council would meet more regularly, countries would inform each other, and the rest. And so to some degree, the move to Belgium was also a kind of political transformation of NATO into that kind of more equal alliance. Of course, the United States is the United States, and small countries like Montenegro or Luxembourg or Iceland will be small countries. But the notion that the big countries, at least had to bring the others along with them, that solidarity is in this sort of spirit of free consultation. The motto that you see in the NATO Council, animus in consulendo liber. The spirit is in free dialogue. I think came from that sort of period, and I really want to emphasise that. The Belgians carried out an intellectual revolution as well as a physical sort of revolution in moving NATO here.
They told me that I always had to be good, but being good always been problems, it's true. So I learned it, and now I know I don't wanna play it.
But we wonder if then moving forward, actually in 1991 the Soviet Union and the USSR dissolves. So this is a lengthy process, but why did that happen actually? And also people argue that NATO became obsolete.
Well, I suppose you've got to give Mikhail Gorbachev, who died recently, celebrated in the West, largely forgotten in Russia itself. Putin didn't even bother to attend his funeral, which I think was absolutely scandalous. And if you ever want a sort of indication of the theory of the role of the individual in history, it's Gorbachev. So you do have to give Gorbachev some of the credit for being prepared to engage reforms and not stopping those reforms. And what happened with Gorbachev, he peeled an onion skin. And when you peel an onion skin, there's another layer to peel. In other words, as he started to reform, he realised that the solution to the reform lay in reforming something else. And he did something which the Chinese abhor, which is that he reformed the political system as the path to reforming the economy, which I suppose is the approach that we would take in a liberal democracy, right? And so he allowed the first free elections. He got rid of the monopoly of the Soviet Communist Party. He freed the media. And when it became clear, for example, that certain of the republics of the Soviet Union were determined to break away, notably the Baltic states in 1990, he didn't stop it. Well, he tried, but when he realised it was going to, in Lithuania, cause bloodshed, he stopped very, very quickly. And he was prepared to see the future of the Soviet Union as a collection, as going back to the original idea of 1917, initially under Lenin, of a kind of confederation of independent states. He didn't want to get rid of the Soviet Union. That was never Gorbachev's purpose. But basically, he sort of lost control of the events in a good sense. The problem was really twofold, I think, for the Soviet Union. The first thing was, of course, that the Communist Party had based its legitimacy on the notion that it represented the future of mankind. It would bring prosperity, it would bring success. It didn't hold free elections, but free elections weren't necessary because they were on the right side of history, right? And once, of course, Gorbachev started to allow different parties to compete and admit candidly that the Soviet Union was an economic failure, he took away all legitimacy from communists. They want the future of history, so no right to rule. The second thing is by agreeing to restructure the Soviet Union into a loose confederation, he gave basically a voice to Boris Yeltsin, his great rival, the head of the Moscow Central Party. Yeltsin was a Russian nationalist, and basically the Russians said, look, if the Soviet Union is going away, we are top dog. We are going to be the successor state. We in the Tsarist times were always the dominant state in this structure, and therefore we are going to have a negotiation which makes sure that we come back to our sort of dominant role in the structure. So Gorbachev, unfortunately, in dissolving the Soviet Union, unleashed something that we're very familiar with in European history, and we're dealing with it with Putin, of course, in Ukraine today, tragically, is this unfettered sort of Russian imperialism, and this sense that it has some kind of natural right to dominate. Putin would call it Novorossiya, but the former Soviet space. So as with most great historical events, you get the good side, but unfortunately you get the bad side too.
So the Soviet Union dissolves, but then people argue, they give a bit of critique, they say, no more adversary, no more need for NATO.
Well, I remember that because over the road in the old building, I remember Manfred Werner, who was his picture is right behind you. I'm looking at him. He is one of the great Secretary Generals of NATO and one of the great bosses I was so lucky to serve under. I remember he gathered us all together a couple of weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 in the cafeteria, and we all thought he was going to announce job cuts. We did. There were all rumours going around, 10% immediate job cuts. People called it catastrophic success. There was a famous Soviet academician called Georgy Arbatov, who used to go around the conference circuit saying, "We, the Russians, we have done something terrible to you. We have taken away your threat. No threat, no existence." But Werner was very prophetic, and Werner said basically, look, there are two things that you all need to know why NATO is going to become stronger. Totally counterintuitive. He said the first thing is that this is a time of great uncertainty, where everything is shifting. And at a time of great uncertainty, what you have to do in the West is maintain the structure of predictability, of stability. You don't want to change because you don't know where change is going to go. Is it going to remain peaceful? Nobody knows. Is it going to turn violent? What happens when nuclear powers start to disintegrate from within? And that was a very powerful argument. At a time of great uncertainty, you stay united, you stay strong, so that you've got a better chance of influencing events. The second thing that he said was that basically, over the history of NATO, the Europeans have done something which they've never done before. They have collectivized their security with a non-European power, the United States. So the problem of Germany, do we go left, do we go right? Are we in Middle Europe? Where do we stand? Who do we ally with? France, this obsession all the time with weak France vis-a-vis strong Germany. Britain, do we engage in Europe? Do we not? All of these dilemmas that caused so many wars in the 19th century, NATO's taken them away. It's like your insurance policy. You have something which means that now security is something which is shared, and basically nobody wants to give that up and go back to purely national security. How can I protect myself on all of my borders against all of my potential adversaries all by myself? And basically, Werner was right. And also Werner recognised that this was an opportunity for NATO to play a new role, which is that all of these countries of Central and Eastern Europe were crying out for cooperation with NATO. If you look outside there's Werner sitting with Václav Havel. I met him, a playwright, dissident. He was in prison in Czechoslovakia during the Soviet period, and he comes to the NATO Council, I think about 1993-4, apologises for all of the lies that communism told about NATO. And Havel, together with others like Lech Walesa of Poland and these other great anti-communist leaders, said, look, we want to join the West. Our place is with you in a democratic Europe. We need to reform our armed forces. We need to reform our intelligence services. We need to build new security strategies. We can't do it alone. Help us. And so one of, I think, the geniuses of Werner is that he sees that NATO can reinvent itself, not as an alliance defending itself against Eastern Europeans, but as an alliance which is gradually corresponding, to this security vacuum in Central and Eastern Europe, and bringing these countries in. And so within a few years, you have this invention of these incredible things, the Partnership for Peace, where all of these countries meet around the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council table. In NATO, NATO sending advice teams out to these countries. We even went to Russia. Yes, there are pictures of me at Red Square with the NATO Secretary General. Even the Russians were interested initially in this form of cooperation with NATO. So, NATO sort of was able to see, that it could sort of be a shape, not just sort of on the defensive, protecting itself, but could actually be a diplomatic force, an active sort of shaper of change. And Werner's great doctrine was that there are risks and opportunities, and you need NATO to guard against the risks, but you need NATO to also take advantage of the opportunities.
Just a lot of diplomacy going on. If we look at the history of NATO, I think we can make a big distinction. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. We even have a piece of the Berlin Wall in front of the headquarters here in Brussels. So a lot changed for NATO, and NATO also was a defensive organization, but goes on the offensive as well. So what would be
the political offensive? Not the military offensive, the political offensive, yeah.
But what would be the first mission of NATO after the Cold War?
Well, I suppose, Bart, it all depends how you define missions. If you want to call all of these advisory teams that we sent out to Central and Eastern Europe under the Partnership for Peace,
that's super
they were missions of a sort because they formed these kind of permanent structured relationships. And of course, all of these military reforms, aligning with Western structures, putting armed forces for the first time under democratic control, taking them away from all-powerful ministers of defence and so on. That took a lot of work. It was not easy because these countries had been under a Soviet system for nearly half a century, and it was painful in terms of the choices they had to make. For example, getting rid of many of their old military officers who had to be retrained. We even worked with the World Bank. I remember on teaching old, communist military officers to learn Excel spreadsheets on their laptops so that they could get jobs in the private sector and retrain it. It was not at all easy. But I suppose if you mean big military missions, in the sense of NATO sending its forces beyond its borders, that was in the former Yugoslavia. There was a party mood in Europe, 1990. In Germany, newspapers are writing articles, let's get rid of the Bundeswehr, we don't need the military any longer. Love has broken out, peace has broken out, the peace dividend. You remember an American academic, Francis Fukuyama, wrote this famous piece about the end of history. Liberal capitalism has triumphed, there are no adversaries any longer. Yes, how long did that last, right? But in 1990, we got a bit of a shock when we realised that the exit from communism was not going to be peaceful everywhere in Europe. And of course, that was in Yugoslavia, where the country was unable to sort of trace a future out of communism in terms of the constitutional change. Serbia was not ready to agree with Croatia and Slovenia on decentralisation and economic reform. Those two countries declared independence in the summer of 1991, and the Serbs, particularly Slobodan Milosevic, the Serb leader, responded by sending military forces into Slovenia, 9-day war, and then into Croatia, where the war was tragic, and we began to see, those things that are very familiar to people: ethnic cleansing, hateful propagandist media, telling people to literally go and kill their neighbours before they're killed themselves, the use of military force to dictate outcomes in Europe, what Putin is trying to do today in Ukraine, large numbers of refugees fleeing out of the country. TV every night, showing all of these horrors and asking, Mr. Clinton, Mr. Blair, Mr. Chirac, what are you doing about it? Why are you not intervening and the rest? And so NATO didn't respond immediately. Maybe we should have. That's a legitimate, I suppose, criticism. In hindsight, we should have acted earlier. But NATO gradually got sucked into the conflicts of the ex-Yugoslavia. And so you had, in 1993, NATO committing its air forces to defend UN peacekeepers in Bosnia at the time. The war in Bosnia became the most intense and the most costly, over 100,000 killed, 2.5 million people refugees. Then you had in 1995 NATO carrying out an air campaign against Bosnian Serb forces. Then at the end of 95 the military intervention works. The Serbs go to Dayton in Ohio with the other parts of the former Yugoslavia, particularly the Croats. They sign a peace agreement, the Dayton Peace Agreement, which is still in effect today, and NATO does its first big military mission, not just in the air but on the ground. It sends 60,000 troops into Bosnia at Christmas 1995 to implement the Dayton Peace Agreement. They stay for 9 years. They're followed by a European Union force, which, Bart, today is still there in Sarajevo. Yeah, still sort of keeping this very fragile state together.
Unfortunately, there was another very big event, and we can also see it if we walk to the head office here. We see one piece of the Berlin Wall from '89. On the other side, we see a piece of the World Trade Center from Manhattan, New York, USA. So the 9/11, the terrorist attacks, a big event. What did that big event actually do to NATO? What did it mean for NATO?
Well, there was this massive outpouring of sympathy for the United States. Le Monde, the French newspaper, had this legendary headline the next day which said, "Nous sommes tous des Américains." We're all Americans now. There was, and people from about 60 countries were killed in the Twin Towers. So there was really a sense that this is an attack on, if you like, sort of liberal democracy, not just an attack on the United States, it's an attack on all of us. The next day, NATO, under the Secretary General George Robertson, convenes and declares Article 5 for the first time in its history. In other words, the Collective Defence Clause, as a gesture of solidarity with the United States. And what it means is that if the United States is able to prove that this attack was organised by a state from outside the NATO area, then the Europeans will assist the United States in responding to that attack. So it's a big, big, big decision. It's a bit of a surprise to NATO traditionalists because Article 5 was always the Americans coming to the defence of Europe, right? Not Europe going to the defence of New York or Washington. But it showed that at the end of the day, Article 5 also has to be adapted to new threats. That's the first consequence. It can't just be the conventional scenario of a hostile neighbour to the east attacking NATO territory. There are new threats out there, from hyperterrorism, from cyber attacks, from sabotage operations, disinformation campaigns, space, somebody destroying your vital communication satellites in space, which are the equivalent of an armed attack. It can be with electrons. As well as bullets. So it's the beginning of this kind of Copernican revolution in NATO to see that Article 5 and the definition of what is an armed attack in the 21st century is obviously going to look somewhat different, and NATO has to adapt its responses to those things. Anyway, the Americans very quickly proved that the attack was instigated by Afghanistan, that the Taliban government in Afghanistan is complicit with what Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden have done. They've sheltered this group for many, many years. And so Article 5 is therefore in operation. But nothing happens. And this has been the subject of a lot of debate, whether NATO should invoke Article 5 without knowing exactly what it means and what it implies. The Europeans think that it means that the Americans are going to ask them to go to Afghanistan. Come with us, all together. They don't. I was present at a very famous meeting of NATO defence ministers just after the 9/11 attacks, where Paul Wolfowitz, who is the Deputy American Defence Secretary, because Mr. Rumsfeld was busy in Washington, says basically, don't call us, we'll call you. You know, when we know what we want you Europeans to do, we'll call you. And eventually the Europeans end up, you know, sending some aircraft to the United States to police the skies over the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, but no big operation in Afghanistan. And that's been a subject of a lot of debate. You know, why did the Americans accept Article 5 but then initially not use it? In future, should NATO not declare Article 5 until it's certain what kind of response is it going to be, for example? Can Article 5, or will Article 5 lose its substance if it's simply a political gesture of solidarity and not a commitment to do something using military forces or material means? But it's 2003, the atmosphere changes, and then the United States is open to a European contribution for the stabilisation mission. So in August 2003, NATO does go to Afghanistan as it takes over from the Netherlands and Germany, the UN-sponsored ISAF mission, International Security Assistance Force, and it stays until August 2021, when you saw, of course, everybody sees on the TV, you know, the circumstances of the withdrawal of the mission that succeeds ISAF, because ISAF finishes in 2014. There's a training mission that follows, but eventually NATO leaves Afghanistan. So yes, you could sort of discuss a little bit the circumstances of 2001 in terms of Article 5, but the big thing for NATO is it shows that Article 5 could be applied to other scenarios and not the sort of classic defence of Eastern Europe scenario that everybody always has in mind.
Thank you for the opportunity for speaking to you, Jamie. Thank you very much for being on a High on List here.
Thank you. Bart, thank you to you. Thanks to Lewis. I greatly enjoyed it.
Thank you. Good.
All right, that's a wrap.
Thanks, Jamie.
What if I'm not good? What if I'm not good? If you never love me back? What if I'm not good? What if I'm not good? If you never love me back? What if I'm not good? What if I'm not good? If you never love me back?
Voilà, faut pas avoir peur de laisser un petit commentaire hein, sur les vidéos. À quoi ça sert que moi je fais tout ça? Ben de lourrique, bande de fainéants, un petit commentaire, c'est bien, c'est pas bien, je m'en fous, faire me kluten nun, liep dans le deuvel, n'importe quoi quand même. Oh, oi, oi.